I went camping with two coworkers because we worked at a small outdoor gear shop and our manager wanted real feedback before winter. We had just gotten a shipment of new four-season tents, heavier fabric, thicker poles, better wind ratings. The kind of stuff people trust when snow loads start to matter. None of us were influencers or testers in any official way. We were just the ones who actually camped enough to notice problems. The plan was simple. One overnight trip, cold weather, uneven ground, no campground pads, no bathrooms, no nearby roads. If the tent failed out there, it would fail anywhere. We picked a trail that was far from popular areas. It wasn't secret or illegal, just ignored. No trailhead sign. No maps in the shop had it clearly marked. It branched off a maintained path and disappeared into older forest. The trees were tall and tight together, mostly pine and fir, with fallen logs everywhere. The ground was uneven and soft, covered in needles. It was the kind of place where sound didn't travel the way you expected. Everything felt muted. We started hiking later than planned because work ran long. By the time we parked, the light was already fading. The air smelled like cold dirt and sap. It wasn't freezing yet, but it had that sharp edge that tells you night is going to drop fast. We moved at a steady pace, packs heavy with gear we didn't really need, but wanted to test anyway. Extra stakes, extra guy lines, multiple ground sheets. We weren't talking much, just focused on making miles before dark. We left the main trail and followed a faint line through the trees. It wasn't overgrown, just quiet. No fresh footprints, no trash, no cut branches. It felt unused, but not abandoned. We found a flat spot about 30 yards off the trail, tucked between a slight rise and a cluster of thick trees. Wind was blocked from most directions. The ground was dry enough. There were old fire scars nearby, long cold, which told us people had camped there before, just not recently. We set up fast, headlamps on, hands cold, stakes driven into soil that fought back more than expected. The tent went up clean, poles seated well, fabric tight. We checked seams, tension, how it handled uneven ground. Everything looked good. We made notes in our heads. No writing, just mental checks. We cooked a simple meal, ate quickly, and packed all food into seal bags. We hung it farther out to see what would happen. Not because we expected animals, but because it was part of the test. We wanted to see if anything got through the closures or scent barriers. By the time we crawled into the tent, the forest was completely dark. No moon. Cloud cover heavy enough to block stars. The only light came from the small glow of our headlamps before we shut them off. Once the lights were gone, the dark felt thick. Not scary, just heavy. The tent fabric creaked as it cooled. Somewhere far away, something small moved through leaves, then stopped. I didn't fall asleep right away. The ground was colder than I expected, even with insulation. I could feel the uneven earth through my pad. My breath sounded loud inside the tent. Every small movement felt amplified. After a while, my body settled and the forest noise blended into a steady background. Wind through branches. Occasional creaks from trees shifting. Nothing sharp, nothing sudden. I woke up without knowing why. My eyes opened to complete darkness. My phone said 1:40 a.m. I hadn't heard anything yet, but my body felt alert in a way that didn't feel like a bad dream. Then it happened. Something heavy moved through the trees. It wasn't fast. It wasn't slow. It moved with purpose. I heard the sound of branches snapping, not cracking under weight, and then pausing, but snapping clean and continuing. It came from one direction and went straight past us. No circling, no stopping, no change in pace. The sound line was clean, like something cutting through the forest without reacting to obstacles. The ground vibrated slightly, just enough to notice through the pad. It passed our camp once. I lay there completely still. My breathing slowed without me thinking about it. The tent fabric didn't move. The guy lines didn't shake. Whatever passed did not touch us. It did not investigate. It did not hesitate. The sound moved away and then was gone. The forest settled back into quiet. No alarm calls. No sudden scatter of animals. Just silence. I stayed awake after that. I don't know how long. My phone battery dropped a few percent as the screen dimmed. I didn't check the time again. I didn't want to move. At some point, exhaustion won and I drifted off. Morning came gray and cold. The light was flat, filtered through cloud and branches. When I unzipped the tent, the air felt heavier than it should have. Damp, still. The forest looked the same as the night before at first glance. Nothing torn, nothing broken near camp. Then I stepped out. The ground around the tent was wrong. All of our footprints were gone, not filled in by wind or fallen needles. Erased. The dirt and needles had been dragged smooth in wide arcs around the tent, like someone had taken a long branch and swept the ground in slow circles. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. The pattern went out several feet in every direction, stopping short of the trees. Beyond that, the forest floor looked untouched. The food hang was still intact, bag sealed, no teeth marks, no disturbance, no pulled lines, nothing missing. I walked the perimeter slowly. No clear tracks. Whatever had passed didn't leave clean prints. The soil was too soft and too disturbed. Branches nearby showed fresh breaks at chest height. Not claw marks, not chew marks, clean snaps, thick ones, the kind that take force. We packed up without rushing, but without lingering. The tent came down clean. No damage, no tears, no bent poles. The test was technically a success, but none of that mattered anymore. The forest felt different in daylight, not threatening, just watched, like we had slept through something that chose not to stop. On the hike out, I noticed how straight the disturbed line through the trees was. It didn't wander. It didn't follow terrain. It cut across the slope without adjusting. Branches broken in a path that made no sense for an animal moving naturally through brush. We reached the car without incident. No sounds, no movement, just normal woods again. Back at the shop, I wrote up the tent report. Strong fabric, good tension, stable overnight, no issues. I left out everything else. I still think about that night, not because of fear, but because of how precise it was. Whatever moved through that forest knew exactly where it was going. It did not care about us enough to slow down, but it cared enough to erase our presence while we slept. Not to hide itself, but to make sure we were gone. I don't camp in places like that anymore. Not because something bad happened, but because something chose not to, and I don't trust that choice to happen twice. I camped alone to scout routes before rifle season because daylight never tells the full story. I wanted to see how the slopes funneled movement, how sound carried at night, where I could move quiet before first light. I picked a basin I had hunted before, far from roads, a place with long fingers of timber and open cuts of shale. The forecast was clear. The moon would be thin. I packed light and hiked in late, following a game trail that climbed steady without switchbacks. I set my camp on a bench below a steep rise. Above me, the hillside angled up hard, loose stone mixed with pine needles and low brush. Below, the ground fell away toward a narrow creek that braided through alders. I chose the spot because it sat between two likely travel lines. From there, I could watch both at dawn. The ground was cold and dry. I pitched my small tent tight, staked it well, and laid my gear in order. I cooked nothing. I wanted no smell. I ate cold food and drank water sparingly. As dark settled, the basin closed in. Wind stayed high, brushing the tops of trees without touching the bench. The smell of rock dust and resin hung in the air. I lay back and listened, mapping the sounds. A distant owl, a branch falling somewhere uphill, the sharp crack of wood on stone. The creek far below, steady and low. Everything felt normal. That calm you get when the land shows no interest in you. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that did not fit the map I had built. It came from uphill above my bench out of sight. A clack, then another, then a third. Stone on stone. The spacing was even. Not a tumble, not a slide. 3 contacts, then a pause. Then 3 more. The sound carried clean in the cold air, each impact sharp enough to place. I lay still and listened. The rhythm repeated. 3, pause, 3. Always the same count. The pause long enough to reset attention. The sound moved slightly left over time, but not downslope. It stayed on the same contour, tracking parallel to my camp. I told myself it was rockfall triggered by an animal moving careful through loose shale. But rockfall does not count. It does not stop at 3. It does not wait. It rattles and runs until gravity is done. This sound felt chosen. The clacking continued. Each set landed with intention, the stones contacting square, not glancing. I could hear the difference between a knock and a scrape. These were knocks. My breath stayed shallow. My hands were cold inside my bag. I listened for footfalls between the sets. I heard none. The wind stayed high. The creak stayed low. The rhythm held. I waded through several cycles. My mind went through options. Another hunter marking a route. Someone messing with me. An animal picking up rocks. None of it settled clean. The sound edged closer to my line. Still uphill, still out of sight. I felt that pressure that comes when someone else controls the pace. I did not want to let it continue. I sat up and shouted once, loud and sharp, the way you do when you want to break a pattern without giving more than you must. The sound stopped immediately. Not a taper, not a last clack. It cut clean, as if a switch had been thrown. The hillside went still. No retreat, no shifting weight, no loose stones set free by a startled step. Just silence. I waited. My ears rang from the shout. The night did not answer. Minutes passed. I lay back down with my boots on and my light in hand. Sleep came in thin stretches, broken by checks of the slope. Nothing moved. Nothing sounded. Dawn came slow, a gray lift that revealed edges one at a time. Frost glazed the tent. I crawled out and stood still, letting the cold wake me. The hillside above showed no fresh slides, no disturbed brush. The shale lay as it had before. Then I looked around my camp. At first, I thought the stones were just part of the ground. Then the pattern resolved. Stacks, small cairns, each made of 3 rocks, set with care. They started near my tent, just beyond arm's reach, and ran in a line uphill toward the tree line. Each stack stood a few feet apart, straight and deliberate, place to be seen from the next. Dozens of them climbed the slope, stepping across patches of dirt and needle, bridging gaps where the ground changed. I followed the line with my eyes and then my feet. The stones were local, selected for flat faces, balanced well enough to hold overnight in wind. The stacks stopped at the edge of the timber, right where a game trail cut into the trees. Beyond that, nothing. No stacks, no sign. I knelt and checked for tracks. The ground was dry, but there were marks if you knew how to look. Heel prints without tread, the shallow impression of a soft sole, toes spread for balance on the incline. The steps were careful, angled slightly outward, the way someone moves uphill carrying weight. Between stacks, I found faint scuffs where stones had been lifted and set. No drag marks, no stumble. I walked the line back down toward my camp. Near the start, I found a small clearing where the ground was swept clean, as if someone had sorted stones by size. A few rejects lay to the side. The work had taken time. The explanation came together as I stood there, cold, biting my fingers. Someone had been using the basin at night, moving loads uphill. Stone stacks are old trail language, used where tape and paint would draw attention. 3 knocks at a time is a signal used between people when you do not want to shout. It carries but does not echo far. The pause allows an answer. My shout ended it because it told whoever was there that they had been seen and heard. Later, as I hiked out, I found more signs. A faint cut of boot tread on a ridge, not mine. A length of paracord hidden under a log. Near the tree line, a scrape where a pack had been set down again and again. Farther on, a narrow spur trail that led to a hidden cache, empty now, with a circle of flattened grass where heavy bags had rested. The stacks were not meant for me. They were a temporary road, built overnight to guide movement in the dark, then abandoned when daylight risked discovery. The person stopped when I broke the rhythm because continuing would have meant crossing into the open near my camp. I broke the stacks as I went, kicking them down and scattering stones back into the slope. It took longer than building them had. When I reached the last one, I stood and looked back. The line was gone. The hillside returned to random. I left the basin that morning and did not hunt it that season. Not because of fear, but because the place had been used with a different purpose, quiet and careful, by someone who knew how to move unseen. The land had shown me its other traffic, the kind that works while you sleep, counting stones and steps, stopping clean when challenged, leaving no sound to follow once the sun comes up. I went alone because I could not stand walls anymore. Since the funeral, every ceiling felt low, every room held sound in a way that made my chest tighten. Outdoors, things moved on their own schedule. Wind decided when it spoke. Water decided when it rested. I wanted that distance. I wanted a place that did not know my name or what I had lost. I chose a lake that did not show campsites on any map I owned. It sat past a long carry, reachable only by paddle after a chain of narrow channels. The route filtered people out by effort. By the time I reached open water, my arms burned in a clean way that felt earned. The canoe slid quiet and steady. The lake spread wide and still, a sheet of dull gray under a low sky. Pines ringed it tight, their reflections broken by small ripples that faded before reaching shore. I did not look for a beach. I followed the shoreline until I found a slab of exposed rock that sloped gently into the water. The stone was smooth from ice and time, bare of soil, too hard for tents. That was fine. I planned to sleep out in the open, bag rolled on the rock, no fire. I pulled the canoe up far enough that it rested solid, bow pointed toward the lake out of habit. I set the paddle across the gunnels while I unloaded, then laid it flat on the stone beside me. The sound it made when it touched rock was sharp and familiar. It echoed once and died. The afternoon passed slow. I ate without appetite. I watched clouds drag shadows across the water. A pair of loons crossed the far end of the lake, their wake thin and straight. I stayed still. The rock held the day's heat. When evening came, the temperature dropped fast, the kind of drop you feel in your fingers first. I zipped into my bag and lay on my back, looking up through branches at a strip of sky that darkened from steel to black. Night came clean, no wind. The lake turned into a dark plate that swallowed reflections. The woods across the water became one shape. Insects thinned as the cold set in. The only steady sound was the small wash of water against stone, a soft pull and release that settled into my breathing. I thought I might sleep through the night for the first time in weeks. The sound started after midnight. I did not check a watch. It did not matter. It came from a shoreline to my left, close enough to carry detail. A light tap, then another. Slow, deliberate, wood against something hollow. The exact tone of my paddle when it touched the canoe by accident. I waited for the pattern to break, for it to become waves or a branch. It did not. The spacing stayed even, not hurried, not random. I sat up and listened harder. The rock under me was cold now, leaching heat through the bag. The tapping continued, 3 beats, then a pause, then 3 more. Each contact carried across the water with a small echo that slid along the surface before fading. I did not hear splashing. I did not hear footsteps, only the taps placed with care. My eyes searched the dark line of shore. I saw nothing. The moon had not risen yet. The lake held no light. I stayed still because any movement felt loud. I told myself it was water lifting the paddle and setting it back down, except the paddle lay flat on stone behind me. I told myself it was a loose branch knocking against rock, except the sound was wrong for that, too clean, too controlled. The taps shifted position. They moved a few feet closer to the canoe. The sound changed in pitch, matching the curve of the hull. I felt a tightness in my throat that had nothing to do with cold. My body wanted to make noise, to claim space, to break the rhythm. I did not. I stayed quiet and counted the beats until the pattern broke on its own. When it stopped, the absence felt heavy. The lake went flat again. I waited for the sound to return. It did not. I lay back down, eyes open, listening to my own breath. Sleep came in shallow pieces, broken by dreams that felt like waking. Each time I surfaced, I listened for tapping and heard only water and distant movement in the trees. Morning came pale and clear. Frost glazed the rock in a thin skin that cracked under my fingers when I sat up. The lake had pulled back overnight, the waterline lower by inches. My breath showed. I turned toward the canoe and felt my stomach drop. It sat half in the water, bow aligned straight out, stern still on rock. The angle was precise, not skewed or twisted. The paddle rested inside the canoe, laid lengthwise along the bottom, as if placed there. The stone around it was scuffed with damp marks, arcs where something had slid and pressed. I moved slow, scanning for tracks. The rock showed little, but near the edge, where moss clung in patches, there were grooves, parallel and shallow, leading from water to canoe. At the far end of the slab, a small pile of sticks lay stacked against a crack in the stone, fresh and wet. The smell of chewed wood hung faint in the cold air. The explanation settled as I took it all in. A beaver had worked this shoreline. The lake level drop fit. The stick pile fit. Beavers test objects. They push, pull, and align anything that floats, driven by instinct to manage water and shape space. The tapping came from a stick held in forepaws, used to gauge resistance against the hull, the same way they slap and knock to assess. The rhythm was deliberate because the animal was deliberate. The canoe had been pulled to float point by point as the water receded, guided into alignment by the slope of the rock and the animal's effort to move it out of the way of its work area. The paddle ended up inside because it was loose and light, an obstacle removed and set aside. Understanding did not erase the night. It did not change how the sound had reached into something raw and open in me. It did not soften the fact that another presence had shared that dark space with intent and strength while I lay exposed on stone. What it did was ground the fear in reality, give it edges I could hold. I pushed the canoe back up, feeling the scrape and weight, resetting things to how I needed them. I packed with care. When I paddled away, the lake stayed calm. The rock receded into the line of trees. The woods returned to their work, steady and indifferent. I carried the lesson out with me, along with the quiet understanding that being alone outdoors does not mean being solitary, only unseen. We went because we had no money and too much time. Fall semester was a week away. Rent was due. None of us wanted to sit in our apartments counting days. Camping was cheap if you already owned gear, and between the four of us, we did. We packed food that could stretch, a cooler with ice we hoped would last, and drove until the road thinned into gravel. At the ranger station, the place was quiet and half-lit. A single truck sat out front. The building smelled like paper and dust when we stepped inside. The ranger looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from repeating the same mornings all summer. He pointed at a map on the counter and traced a finger along a few trails. He told us which areas were open and which weren't. He mentioned an unmarked clearing off one spur and said not to camp there. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't threaten fines. He just said it wasn't a good idea and moved on. We nodded, thanked him, and left. Once back in the car, the warning lost weight. Unmarked clearing sounded like nothing. Flat ground mattered more than rules when you were carrying borrowed gear and cheap food. We told ourselves it was probably erosion or a sensitive area or someone getting hurt there once. We wanted easy. The clearing was exactly what we wanted. Open, level, ringed by trees, but wide enough to set tents without roots pushing through the floor. No fire ring, no signposts, no trash. It felt unused, which made it feel like ours. We set up fast, laughing, throwing packs down, spreading out like the place had been waiting. The woods around us were thick, but low. The tree line felt close, pressing in without fully closing. We built a fire in a shallow pit and cooked as the light faded. Smoke hung low. The cooler sat just beyond the firelight, lid weighted with a rock. We ate until we were full and then kept sitting, watching the flames burn down. As night settled, the clearing changed. The trees became a wall instead of background. The fire threw light in a rough circle that ended hard, like a cut edge. Beyond it, the forest absorbed everything. No wind came through. The air felt heavy and still. It started with movement that did not announce itself. A shift in shadow at the edge of the light. Something low, close to the ground, moving where the firelight failed. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Small animals skirt camps all the time. We told ourselves that without saying it out loud. We leaned closer to the fire, adjusting logs, pretending nothing had changed. The movement continued. It did not dart. It did not rush. It stayed just beyond the light, following the edge of it. When one of us shifted, it shifted too. When a log collapsed and the fire flared, the movement paused, then resumed once the light settled back into its circle. I watched the ground, not the trees. Whatever it was stayed low enough that it blended with brush and shadow. It never crossed into the light. It respected that boundary with patience, like it understood it would not be welcome there. The circling became clear over time. It was not random. It moved around us in a wide arc, always outside the firelight, always at the same distance. I tracked it by how the shadows bent and reformed. When it passed behind the cooler, the shape of the darkness changed. When it moved behind a tree trunk, the trunk looked thicker for a moment. No sound came with it. No snapping branches. No rustle of leaves. Just the fire and our breathing and the quiet movement of something that knew how to place its weight. Eventually, the fire burned low. We added wood, but our pile was small. We had not planned to keep it going all night. The flames dropped again, and the circle of light shrank. The movement adjusted immediately, closing in just enough to keep its distance the same. That was when the fear settled in. Not sharp panic, but a steady pressure. The kind that makes your jaw ache from clenching without realizing it. We sat closer together. No one suggested sleeping yet. No one joked anymore. At some point, the movement stopped. Not because it left, but because it found a place to stay. The shadows on one side of the clearing grew dense and still, as if something had crouched there and decided to wait. The fire cracked and popped, sending sparks up into the dark. The shape did not flinch. We did not last much longer after that. We let the fire die and retreated into our tents, zipping them closed with care. I lay awake, listening through fabric and thin ground. The clearing felt smaller without the fire. The dark pressed close, no longer held back by light. I heard something brush against the cooler. Not a bump, a slow contact, then nothing. I counted breaths. I waited for more. It did not come. Sleep took me in pieces. Morning came pale and quiet. The clearing looked harmless again, just dirt and trees and tents sagging with dew. Birds moved through the branches like nothing had happened. For a few seconds, I wondered if the night had been a shared imagination, fed by boredom and cheap food. Then I saw the cooler. 3 long scratches ran across the side, deep and clean. The plastic had peeled up in thin curls, white beneath the surface. The marks were parallel, spaced evenly. They started near the lid and dragged down, as if whatever made them had tested the material and stopped. The lid was still closed. The rock still sat on top. We crouched around it, tracing the damage with our eyes. The scratches were not from teeth. They were too straight, too deep. Claws did that kind of work. Something strong enough to score plastic without tearing it apart. Around the cooler, the ground showed faint signs. Pressed dirt where weight had shifted. A shallow groove where something had dragged a paw or forelimb. No clear tracks, just impressions that suggested bulk and patience. Later, after we packed up and drove out, we learned why the ranger had warned us. The unmarked clearing sat on a game path used by a large black bear that had learned camps meant food. Not aggressive, but persistent. It circled camps, stayed out of firelight, tested coolers and packs, learned what it could and could not take. Rangers avoided marking the clearing to keep people from choosing it for convenience. The explanation fit every detail. The low movement, the circling, the respect for the fire, the strength needed to peel plastic without breaking it open. Understanding did not make the memory softer. It made it sharper. We had ignored a warning because it was easy. We had put ourselves in the path of something that moved with purpose and patience, something that did not need to rush or scare us to get what it wanted. We never camped there again. We stopped treating warnings like suggestions. Being broke and bored felt different after that, smaller somehow, compared to the quiet certainty of something watching from just outside the light, waiting for you to make a mistake. I took my son because I wanted him to learn that fear does not have to decide things for you. He was 10, careful in the way kids get when they think they should be brave, but are not sure how. I had grown up camping. He had slept in tents before, but always close to home, always with other families around. This time I wanted it to be just us, a clean start, a simple place where he could see that the dark does not mean danger by itself. I chose a small public campground tucked beside a river bend, far enough from town to feel quiet but not remote. The kind of place with space sites, a pit toilet, and a host who checked passes once a day. We arrived mid-afternoon. The site was open, level, and dry. Pine needles covered the ground like a thin mat. No trash, no signs of recent parties. The fire ring was cold and empty. I liked that right away. We set up together. I let him thread poles and stake corners. I showed him how to test tension by pressing the fabric with a flat hand. He paid attention. He asked good questions. The tent stood firm, the rain fly tight. I felt a small lift in my chest, watching him move with purpose. The woods around us were open, mature trees spaced wide, with low brush that stopped at knee height. Visibility was good. The river moved slow, a dark ribbon through the trees. Birds settled as evening came. We ate simple food and watched the sky fade. When it got cold, we zipped into our bags. He fell asleep fast, the kind of deep sleep that comes from fresh air and effort. I woke some time later without knowing why. The fire had burned down to ash. The world felt held still, as if everything had leaned closer. I lay there listening. The river made its steady sound. A breeze moved high branches. Nothing else pressed in. I started to relax. Then my son stirred beside me. His breathing changed. He shifted closer, the way he did when he needed reassurance. He whispered my name. His voice was tight and careful, as if any louder sound might break something. He told me there was someone standing outside the tent. My body reacted before my thoughts caught up. Heat rushed to my face. My hands went still. I listened hard. I expected to hear footsteps retreating, fabric brushing past, a cough, anything. I heard nothing. The tent walls did not move. The zipper lay flat. The air inside felt thin. I did not unzip the door. I did not reach for a light. I placed a hand on my son's shoulder, steady and firm, and kept my eyes on the faint outline of the tent wall. I told myself that opening the flap would only turn a shape into a certainty, and certainty might force a response I could not control. Minutes passed in pieces. My heart slowed a little. My ears strained so hard they rang. The woods did not answer my attention. No steps faded away. No branch snapped. The river stayed the same. Eventually, my son's breathing eased. He did not sleep deeply again, but he rested. I did not sleep at all. Morning came gray and cool. Light seeped through the fly and filled the tent with soft color. Birds returned to their routines. I moved slow, careful not to startle him. When I unzipped the door, the sound felt too loud in the quiet. The ground outside held the night like a record. Dew clung to needles and dirt. At first glance, everything looked normal. Then I saw the prints. They came from the tree line on the far side of the site. Bare feet, small to medium size, pressed clean into the damp soil between patches of pine needles. The toes showed clear edges. The heels sank deeper than the balls, a sign of someone stepping carefully. The line moved straight, not wandering. It led to within arm's length of the tent flap and stopped. There were no prints circling, no scuff marks near the fire ring, no sign of turning away. Just an end, abrupt and clean, as if the person had paused there and then retraced their steps with care or stepped on a rock. I felt cold settle in my stomach. I walked the area slowly, marking details. Beyond the end point, the ground changed to harder dirt and exposed roots. Prints vanished there. Along the riverbank, I found more signs. Flattened grass near the water. A small pile of smooth stones stacked near a log. Something done by hands, not water. On the far edge of the campground, near a closed site, there was a sleeping pad rolled tight and tucked under a bush, still warm to the touch, abandoned in haste or intention. I took my son to the picnic table and gave him food. He ate without appetite, watching me. I kept my voice even and my movements calm. When he finished, I told him we were packing up early because weather might change. He nodded and did not argue. Before leaving, I walked to the host site. The host was not there, but a notice board held a paper from the local ranger service. It mentioned a transient man who had been camping along the river for weeks, moving between sites at night, often barefoot, known to sleepwalk when stressed. Campers had reported him standing near tents without awareness, waking confused, then leaving quietly. The note asked people to report sightings and avoid confrontation. The explanation fit the details. Bare feet, straight approach, no sound leaving, stopping close without touching. Someone half awake, drawn by light or sound, then frozen by realization or confusion. The abandoned pad fit too. A person living on the edge, drifting, not violent but unpredictable. Understanding did not erase the night. It did not undo the image of someone standing close enough to touch fabric while my child lay beside me. What it did was give shape to the fear and limits to its reach. We drove home in silence. Later, when I tucked my son into his bed, he asked if we would camp again. I told him yes, and I meant it. Confidence is not the absence of fear. It is knowing what fear looks like when the light comes up and choosing to step forward anyway, with your eyes open and your hands steady on the zipper. I needed to disappear because everything familiar felt sharp. After the divorce, the house echoed in a way I could not soften. Objects stayed where they had always been, but nothing fit. I took a few days off work, packed without a list, and drove until pavement thinned into gravel and then into a rutted track that had not seen maintenance in years. The logging road was still readable if you knew what to look for. Old culverts, moss-grown stumps, tire ruts filled with needles. Alder had pushed in from both sides, narrowing the way. I parked where the road dipped toward a dry creek bed and carried my pack down on foot. The creek had cut a shallow channel through rock and clay, empty now except for a few pools caught in shade. The banks were steep enough to block wind. It felt tucked away without being hidden. I set my tent on a patch of firm ground just above the bed. The soil that was compacted from past runoff, clean of leaves and brush. I like that. I like being able to see the approach from both directions. I laid my boots just outside the tent flap, toes pointing out, laces loose. The habit came from years of working outside. Boots stayed ready. Evening came early in the creek. Light slid away fast, leaving the channel in shadow. I ate cold food and drank water that tasted faintly of plastic. The air cooled and settled. The smell of dry stone and old wood filled the space. When I lay down, the ground held the day's warmth longer than I expected. The walking started after full dark. It did not rush me awake. It worked its way in through repetition. A step, then another, measured and even. It came from the creek bed below, moving along the channel rather than toward camp. Back and forth, the same distance each time. I listened for leaves and heard none. I listened for loose rock and heard none. Whoever was placed their weight with care, choosing stone edges and packed dirt, moving like someone who had learned how sound travels at night. I stayed still and counted passes. The pace never changed. The path stayed the same. When the steps reached the far end of the stretch, they turned without pause and came back. No shuffle, no hesitation. Just a change in direction. I try to picture it as an animal. Deer move light, but they slip on rock. Coyotes scuff. Bears breathe loud and break brush. This was none of that. This was controlled. The sound stayed low, close to the ground, the kind you get from soft soles or bare feet. The creek bed acted like a corridor, carrying the sound clean. My tent sat just high enough that the walker never crossed onto leaves. They stayed in the channel where each step could be placed without noise. Fear came in layers. First awareness, then tension, then the slow realization that whoever it was knew exactly where to walk to stay unheard. I did not move. I did not reach for a light. I kept my breathing shallow and steady. Hours passed that way. The walking never approached the tent. It never retreated far. It claimed that strip of ground and worked it back and forth like a task. At some point, exhaustion dulled the edge of it. I slept in short, broken stretches, waking each time the rhythm changed slightly with the slope. When morning came, it felt abrupt. Light spilled into the creek, showing pale stone and the dark line of damp soil. The walking stopped without announcement. I lay there a moment, listening for anything else. The place felt empty again. I unzipped the tent and reached for my boots. My hand closed on nothing. I leaned out and looked. The ground where they had been was bare, the soil smooth as if brushed by a sleeve. No scuff marks, no drag lines, just absence. I stood in my socks and scanned the area. The creek bed showed prints now that the light was right. Long, narrow impressions with even spacing. The toes pointed straight, not splayed. The heels pressed light. Whoever had walked there knew how to keep weight centered. I followed the creek downstream. 20 yards away, on a flat shelf of stone, my boots sat side by side. Toes aligned, laces tucked in. They looked placed for inspection, not dropped. The leather was dry. No mud, no damage. Understanding came slow but clean. This was not a threat meant to rush or scare. It was a check. Someone else used that creek bed as a path, likely every night. A person living light, moving without noise because noise brings attention. They had seen my camp in daylight or smelled it after dark. They had walked the channel to learn my habits. When they took the boots, it was to see if I would react, if I would give chase, if I would make sound. When nothing happened, they brought the boots back and set them where I would find them without searching. A quiet message that the space was shared, that movement had been observed, that harm was not the goal. Later, as I packed up, I noticed more signs. A length of flattened grass under a log near the creek bend, shaped like a bed used often. A plastic bottle crushed and tucked into a rock crack. Footprints leading off the channel toward a slope that climbed back to the old road. The explanation fit the place and the care. Someone living out there, using the creek to move unseen, avoiding leaves because leaves talk, barefoot or in soft shoes because rubber slaps. They had rules for themselves. They followed them. I put my boots on and laced them tight. I left the site clean. As I walked back up the road, the weight in my chest eased a little. The woods had not singled me out. I had crossed into someone else's routine during a moment when I wanted no witnesses. I drove home that day. The house still echoed, but it felt less sharp. What stayed with me was not fear, but the certainty that even when you think you have disappeared, someone else may already be moving through the same quiet, placing each step with care, watching without needing to be seen. I went out to photograph fog and moss because both need patience and bad weather. Clear days flatten them. Rain gives them depth. I needed new work for a portfolio, textures that felt alive without being loud. I picked a stretch of forest known for constant mist, a low basin where clouds sink and stay. The trail was short but slick, roots glazed and stones dark with water. Everything smelled green and wet. I set my tent on a small rise above a drainage that carried runoff during storms. The ground there was soft but not saturated, covered in moss thick enough to cushion each step. Trees stood close, their trunks furred with lichen. Light thinned early. Fog moved in waves, drifting between branches and pooling low. I took photos until my hands stiffened and rain thickened from a mist into a steady fall. By evening, the weather pinned me down. The rain came straight down, not driven by wind, heavy enough to bead and run but not loud. I cooked nothing. I wiped my camera and sealed it away. I crawled into the tent and zipped it tight, listening to the forest absorb the water. The rain found its rhythm on the fabric, a soft patter that blended with distant drops hitting leaves. Hours passed. The temperature dropped. Condensation gathered inside the tent and slid in slow lines. At some point, the sound of rain began to stand out. Not louder, not faster, just wrong. The pattern felt too even. Drops usually scatter. They hit at different angles, speeds, and surfaces. This sound landed in clusters, light taps grouped close together, then a pause, then more taps in the same place. I shifted on my pad and listened harder. The sound stayed localized, not moving across the tent the way rain should as wind shifts. It came from one side, near the door. The taps were soft, almost careful, like fingers testing tension. I told myself it was runoff dripping from a branch overhead. I waited for it to slide or change. It did not. The tapping continued, steady and restrained. I held my breath. The sound kept going. When I exhaled, it did not match me. I pressed my palm against the tent wall from inside. The fabric pushed back slightly, then relaxed. The tapping stopped for a moment, then resumed a few inches higher. Fear crept in slow, not sharp enough to force action. I stayed still because movement felt like an invitation. The rain masked other sounds. If there were footsteps, they would vanish under it. The forest felt close, pressed in by fog and water. I did not open the tent. I lay there through the night, tracking the sound as it shifted along the outside wall in small increments. It never rushed. It never pulled at the zipper. It never spoke. It only tapped and pressed, then rested, then tapped again, always facing inward, always testing. Sometime before dawn, exhaustion dulled the edge of it. The tapping faded into the larger sound of rain. Sleep came in shallow pieces. When I woke again, light filtered through gray fabric. The rain had eased to a fine drizzle. The forest smelled clean and sharp. I unzipped the tent and froze. Mud prints covered the outside. Hand-shaped impressions, smeared but clear enough to see fingers and palms. They were everywhere along the door side and wrapped around toward the back. All of them faced inward, palms pressed flat against the fabric, fingers splayed. Some overlapped, some dragged slightly, leaving streaks where weight shifted. The mud was dark and fresh, still wet. I stepped out carefully, heart pounding, scanning the trees. No one stood there. The fog hung low, thinning as light grew. I circled the tent, counting prints. Dozens. They ranged in size, some larger, some smaller, but all human. No bare footprints showed on the moss. Only boot marks leading away toward the drainage, softened by rain. Understanding came as the panic eased. The basin sat below a popular trailhead. During heavy rain, runoff turned the drainage into a fast channel. Rangers and volunteer search crews checked campsites when storms hit, especially unregistered ones like mine. They moved fast, gloved hands muddy from climbing slick ground, bracing against tents to look for movement inside, tapping to see if anyone responded. In daylight, they would call out. At night, with rain drowning sound, they relied on touch and pressure. The consistent tapping fit. Fingers against fabric, testing for tension, for signs of life. The inward-facing prints fit too. Hands planted to steady themselves while leaning close, peering through fog nylon. The lack of voices made sense if they assumed sleep or did not want to startle someone in a storm. The overlapping sizes came from more than one person moving around the tent in rain-slick gloves. I found confirmation a few minutes later. Down by the drainage, a bright strip of survey, tape hung from a branch, fresh and deliberate. It marked rising water levels, a warning placed overnight. Farther up the slope, boot tracks merged into the main trail, heading back toward the road. The explanation settled everything into place, but it did not erase the memory of lying awake, listening to fingers tap and press while the rain covered every other sound. The knowledge that people had been inches from my face, separated only by fabric, watching for signs I did not know how to give, stayed with me. I cleaned the tent as best I could, wiping mud from nylon and seams. The handprints smeared and faded, but faint outlines remained, stretched where palms had pressed hard. I packed slowly and hiked out under thinning fog, camera still sealed away. Later, when I reviewed my photos at home, the images of moss and fog felt different. Softer, but heavier too. I had gone out to capture quiet textures, things shaped by water and time. What I brought back instead was the clear understanding of how thin the line is between shelter and exposure, and how easily the sound you trust can turn strange when the world presses close in the rain. We camped on my uncle's property because it was easy and familiar. The land stretched into a mix of pine and oak, with a creek cutting low into a flat area we had used before. We knew the spots where rocks jutted low, where the ground stayed firm after rain, where the fire would burn without being smothered by leaves. We had done it before in summer, in early fall, even once in late winter, and each time the land felt safe, like it belonged to us. That night, we arrived just before sunset, carrying backpacks with food, wood, and sleeping gear. The fire went up quickly, dry pine catching fast, spreading heat and smell across the clearing. Smoke lingered low, moving in soft waves, and the shadows of the trees stretched long over the ground. We settled in around the circle of flame, moving slowly, checking gear, letting the first chill of night slide in. The creek whispered behind the tree line. Crickets had stopped for the evening, leaving only the occasional plop of water against stone. By the time darkness fell fully, the fire had shrunk to coals. We lay back on pads and blankets, the cold pressing in through jackets and blankets, listening to the soft rhythm of the woods. The trees were still. The wind moved high in the canopy, but left the understory calm. The clearing felt like a cup holding quiet. Then movement came from the edge of the light. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer perhaps, but the shape moved differently. It walked directly into the firelight, slow and careful. I noticed it only as a silhouette, human in shape, but exact details obscured by the glow. The figure paused, facing the four of us without hesitation, just standing in place. No sound, no shout, nothing to draw attention. Then it stepped back into shadow, moving away as quietly as it had come. None of us spoke. None of us moved. Our bodies tensed in instinct, but our minds reached for reason. We had keys to the cabin, a truck not far off, and familiarity with the land. Still, the experience pressed close in a way I had not anticipated. The fire crackled, and we let it carry the noise, listening for any sign that the figure had returned. Nothing came. No footsteps, no rustling leaves, nothing. I stayed awake the rest of the night, tracing edges of the clearing with eyes half-lidded, counting coals in the fire, listening to the creak, listening to each shift of pine needles or low brush. Sleep came in patches. Every time I blinked, I expected to see the figure again, and each time I saw only shadows, trees, and the fire's weak glow. Morning came pale and cold. Light spilled across the clearing, revealing damp ground and frost clinging to leaves near the creek. The fire was down to ash and small embers. I stretched and looked around to check the perimeter, eyes scanning every edge, every tree line. Then I noticed the ground where we had slept. Cigarette butts lay pressed into the dirt, flattened as if stepped on. They were scattered loosely around the spots where we had slept, near pads and blankets, close enough that anyone lying down would have noticed. None of us smoked. The smell of tobacco lingered faintly in the air, sour in contrast to the wet pine and creek water. The soil held the impression of weight above them, like someone had crouched or knelt while distributing them, pressing them intentionally into the dirt. I bent down and checked each one carefully. They were partially crushed, the paper smeared, ash ground into the soil. No footprints led directly from them to any path or the edge of the clearing. The surrounding ground showed no drag marks or disturbances that would indicate someone had rushed away. The impression was deliberate, contained, controlled. I walked the perimeter. The creek had cut small rivulets overnight. Leaves clung to stones, and frost still held in shade, but nothing else disturbed the ground. The figure had left no tracks, no broken branches, no overturned rocks. Just the cigarette butts pressed neatly in place where the four of us had slept. The explanation settled slowly. It was likely someone scouting the land, moving quietly, perhaps testing whether the site was occupied, marking a boundary, or leaving a signal of some kind. The placement of cigarette butts felt ritualistic, a marker for themselves or for someone else. The timing, the silence, the precision of their departure, all pointed to a person who had learned to move unseen, leaving only the faintest trace that could be interpreted but not immediately dangerous. Even understanding did not soften the memory. The silhouette had stepped into the firelight long enough to register its presence, then retreated without pursuit or engagement. The cigarette butts confirmed deliberate behavior, careful observation, and awareness of our location without confrontation. The thought of someone moving through the land we considered ours, without detection, pressed against my sense of safety, even on property I knew intimately. We packed camp slowly, leaving the ash and coals to fade, and hiked back toward the truck. I kept eyes on the edges of trees and brush, noting small shifts, listening to creaks and leaves. No other sign appeared. The land looked familiar again, calm in the rising light, but I carried the memory of deliberate silence and observation. Later, when I thought through it, I realized how easily the line between comfort and exposure can blur. Familiarity with a place does not guarantee safety. Someone with patience and experience could move among trees and shadows, marking their presence without threat, yet leaving you unsettled. The experience reshaped how I approached camping, even on land I knew well. I kept the story to myself initially, sharing only details necessary to convey caution to friends who might visit, but the memory of the silhouette and the hand of tobacco pressed into soil stayed with me, a quiet reminder of precision, patience, and unseen proximity. I went alone because runoff ruins good water, and I wanted to see the creek before snowmelt turned it loud and brown. I had a narrow window between work weeks, just enough time to hike in, walk the banks, and mark bends where trout would hold once levels dropped. Solitude helped me read water better. I moved slower when no one waited on me. The trail followed an old burn scar for the first mile, then dropped into timber where shade kept the ground cold. I smelled pine sap and wet soil. The creek stayed hidden until the last descent, then appeared as a thin, clear ribbon cutting through stones. I crossed twice on slick rocks and chose a bench above a long pool. The place made sense. Undercut banks, a tail out with soft seams, plenty of cover. I set my tent on packed dirt just far enough back to stay dry if the creek rose overnight. As dusk came on, the temperature slid down fast. I ate cold food and filled notes in a small book. That was when the smell reached me. It was not faint. It rolled in heavy and wrong, the thick, sweet edge of rot that clings to the back of your throat. I stood and followed it with my nose, moving slow, scanning brush and logs. Carcasses happen in spring. Winter takes animals hard, and predators leave scraps. I expected to find hair, bones, something. I found nothing. The smell came and went as I moved, stronger near the creek, weaker upslope. I checked eddies and cut banks for dead fish. Nothing floated. The water ran clean. I walked a wider circle and found no sign of kill, no tracks torn up, no scatter. When the light failed, the smell thinned and then vanished as if it had been carried off by a change in air. I told myself it had been something old and buried, warmed by the day and then sealed again by cold. Night settled in quiet. The creek murmured. Wind brushed high branches and stayed there. I zipped into my bag and lay on my side, listening to the water I planned to fish. Sleep came light. I woke often, not afraid, just alert, the way you get when the dark feels close. Sometime after midnight, I noticed breathing that was not mine. It took a moment to separate it from my own chest. Slow, wet pulls of air, each followed by a soft release. It came from just outside the tent wall, so close that the fabric seemed to carry it. The rhythm did not match me. When I held my breath, it continued. When I shifted, it did not change. I lay still and counted. The breathing stayed steady. I listened for footfalls and heard none. No scraping, no sniffing bursts, just the damp draw of air moving through something large enough to fill the space beside my head. The smell returned with it, muted but present, the same rot I had followed at dusk. My hand closed around my headlamp without turning it on. Light felt like a bad idea. I did not want to surprise whatever leaned there. The nylon pressed inward at shoulder height, not sharp like a paw, but broad as if weight rested against it. The tent bowed and held. Each breath fogged the inside, adding to the damp chill. Time stretched. I did not know how long it stayed. Long enough for my legs to numb and for fear to settle into a cold clarity. I thought through animals. A bear made sense for size and breath, but bears usually test with noise, with snorts and claws. This was different. This felt like something conserving effort, content to rest where it was. I stayed still until the breathing eased and then faded, not with steps away, but with distance, as if the weight lifted and the sound slid off into the creek noise. The smell thinned again. I did not sleep after that. I waited for light with my eyes open. Morning came pale and cold. Frost traced the tent seams. When I unzipped, the air smelled clean. The rot was gone. I stepped out and saw the tent wall where it had been pressed. The nylon showed a stretched oval. The weave thinned and shiny where it had held pressure for hours. The ground there was scuffed smooth, dirt compacted into a shallow dish. No clear tracks showed in the hard soil, but the shape of the depression was broad and heavy. I walked the area slow. Along the creek, I found drag marks in gravel, shallow and intermittent, leading to a bank shaded by alder. There, tucked under roots, lay the reason for the smell. A pile of fish carcasses, trout and whitefish, stripped and cached, some fresh, some days old. The flesh had gone sour. Bears cache food like that, covering it lightly and returning when hunger brings them back. The breathing had been labored because the bear was sick or old, lungs wet from a winter infection. The pressure against the tent made sense too. A bear leaning its weight to rest, drawn by salt from sweat and food smells that cling no matter how careful you are. I found bear hair snagged on a thorn nearby, coarse and dark. The picture closed. The animal had fed at dusk, the air had shifted, and the smell had reached me. At night, it followed the creek, found my camp, and chose the tent as a windbreak while it slept off a heavy meal. It did not test the door because it was not hungry enough to risk effort. It leaned and breathed and left when dawn thinned the dark. I broke camp without rushing. I cleaned the site and moved on, keeping distance from the cache. The creek still looked right for trout, but I marked the place as one to avoid until the bear moved on. The stretched nylon stayed with me as I hiked out, proof of how close a large, real thing can be without sound or threat, how it can share your space for hours while you lie still, counting breaths that do not belong to you.